In the autumn of 1918, the German Empire collapsed. The Kaiser had fled, the military had been defeated, and a new democratic government was scrambling to pick up the pieces of a shattered nation. What followed was one of the most remarkable economic catastrophes in modern history. A crisis so severe that it would fundamentally alter the course of the 20th century and help pave the way for one of humanity's darkest chapters. This is the story of how hyperinflation destroyed the Weimar Republic. November 1918 saw the birth of Germany's first true democracy. The Weimar Republic, named after the town where its constitution was drafted, came into existence during Germany's moment of greatest weakness. The war was lost. 2 million young German men lay dead, another 4.2 million wounded. At home, civilians were starving from years of Allied blockade. The streets of major cities were filled with demonstrations, strikes, and the threat of communist revolution loomed large. In February 1919, a National Assembly convened in Weimar, deliberately chosen over Berlin because the capital was too unstable, too dangerous, too consumed by political violence. The delegates crafted what was, on paper, one of the most progressive democratic constitutions in Europe. Women could vote for the first time in German history. Representatives were elected by proportional representation. Individual freedoms were enshrined in law. The Social Democratic Party leader, Friedrich Ebert, became the first president of this new republic. But the republic was born with a target on its back, blamed from the very beginning for Germany's defeat. Many Germans subscribed to what became known as the stab-in-the-back myth. The idea that Germany's armies hadn't been defeated on the battlefield but had been betrayed by politicians at home, by socialists, communists, and Jews who had undermined the war effort. The Republic's leaders were branded the November criminals for signing the armistice. This association with defeat would haunt the Weimar government for its entire existence. Even before the Weimar Constitution was finalized, Germany teetered on the edge of civil war. In January 1919, just weeks after the armistice, communist revolutionaries known as the Spartacists launched an uprising in Berlin. Led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, the Spartacist League wanted to turn Germany into a Soviet-style communist state. They seized control of government buildings, newspapers, and telegraph offices. Chancellor Ebert faced a crisis. The regular army was demobilized, exhausted, and unreliable. He made a fateful decision. He turned to the Freikorps. These were paramilitary groups made up of ex-soldiers, many of them bitter, angry men who refused to accept Germany's defeat. They were right-wing, nationalist, and often brutal. But they were organized and willing to fight. The Freikorps crushed the Spartacist uprising with extreme violence. By January 13th, it was over. Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht were arrested and murdered while in custody, their bodies dumped in a canal. The Republic had survived, but at a terrible cost. It had relied on forces that despised democracy to save democracy. The Freikorps had tasted blood and power, and they would not forget it. The violence didn't stop. In Bavaria, communists briefly established a Soviet-style republic in April 1919. The Freikorps was sent in again, slaughtering over 1,000 people in brutal street fighting. Throughout 1919, Germany was in a state resembling civil war, with leftist uprisings and right-wing death squads battling for control. Then, in March 1920, the threat came from the right. The Treaty of Versailles required Germany to drastically reduce its military, which meant disbanding many Freikorps units. In response, about 5,000 Freikorps soldiers, led by Wolfgang Kapp and General Walther von Lüttwitz, marched on Berlin and attempted to overthrow the government. They took control of the capital. President Ebert ordered the army to stop them. The army refused. General Hans von Sicht, head of the Reichswehr, famously declared that troops do not fire on troops. The government fled Berlin, powerless. The Kapp Putsch, as it became known, only failed because German workers went on a general strike. Within days, Berlin was paralyzed. No trains ran, no water flowed. The putsch collapsed after just 4 days, and Kapp fled to Sweden. But the message was clear. The Weimar Republic could not rely on its own military to defend it. The army's loyalty lay not with democracy, but with the old order. The consequences were devastating. The failure to severely punish the Kapp putsch participants sent a message: right-wing violence would be tolerated. The judiciary, still filled with judges appointed during the Kaiser's reign, showed extreme leniency toward right-wing extremists while cracking down harshly on leftists. And the unrest started immediately. Between 1919 and 1923, Germany descended into a nightmare of political terrorism. In total, 376 political assassinations occurred during these years. The Organization Council, a right-wing terrorist group made up of former Freikorps members, led the campaign of murder. In August 1921, they struck their first major target, Matthias Erzberger, Germany's finance minister. Erzberger had committed 2 unforgivable sins in the eyes of the radical right. First, he had signed the armistice in November 1918, making him one of the hated November criminals. Second, he had implemented strict tax reforms to try to stabilize Germany's economy, angering wealthy conservatives. He was gunned down while taking a walk at a spa in the Black Forest. The assassins escaped to Hungary and faced minimal consequences. Then, in June 1922, came the murder that shocked Germany to its core. Walther Rathenau, the foreign minister, was driving to his office when his car was ambushed. Assassins sprayed him with machine gun fire and threw a grenade into his vehicle for good measure. He died almost instantly. Rathenau's murder was particularly inflammatory because he was Jewish. The radical right had vilified him relentlessly, calling him part of a Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy to destroy Germany. His actual crime? He was trying to rebuild Germany's shattered foreign relations and economy. He had negotiated the Treaty of Versailles with Soviet Russia, which pragmatically sought to end Germany's isolation. He insisted that Germany had to meet its obligations under Versailles, not because he liked the treaty, but because defiance would only make things worse. The right-wing press celebrated his death with anti-Semitic slurs and triumphant declarations, but the broader German public was horrified. Hundreds of thousands marched in mourning. The Weimar government finally acted, passing the Law for the Protection of the Republic, which banned extremist organizations and imposed stricter penalties for political violence. The Organization Council was officially disbanded. But it was too little, too late. The damage was done. A statistician named Ernst Julius Gumbel meticulously documented the judiciary's bias. Between 1918 and 1922, right-wing extremists committed 354 political murders. Left-wing extremists committed 22. The average sentence for a right-wing murderer? 4 months in prison and a 2-mark fine. For left-wing murderers? 15 years or death. The message to Germans was unmistakable. The justice system didn't believe in the Republic. Violence against democratic politicians would be tolerated, even tacitly approved, if it came from the right. The rule of law was a fiction. Democracy was weak. And then came Versailles. In May 1919, German delegates were summoned to Paris. They weren't invited to negotiate. They were presented with terms and told to sign. When they saw what the Allies demanded, the reaction was one of shock and outrage that rippled across Germany. The Treaty of Versailles was designed to ensure Germany could never wage war again. Germany lost 13% of its territory and 10% of its population. Alsace-Lorraine went to France. The Saar region was placed under League of Nations control for 15 years. The Polish corridor cut through German territory, separating East Prussia from the rest of the country. All overseas colonies were stripped away. The military was gutted, limited to just 100,000 men with no general staff, no submarines, no air force, no tanks. The Rhineland, Germany's industrial heartland, was to be occupied by Allied troops for up to 15 years and permanently demilitarized. But it was Article 231, the infamous War Guilt Clause, that cut deepest. This clause declared Germany solely responsible for starting the war and all the destruction that followed. It wasn't just a legal technicality to justify reparations. To Germans across the political spectrum, it was a moral condemnation, a national humiliation etched into international law. Based on this guilt, Germany was ordered to pay reparations for all the damage caused by the war. The final figure wouldn't be determined until 1921, when the London schedule of payments set it at 132 billion gold marks, equivalent to over $31.5 billion at the time, roughly $500 billion in today's money. Annual payments were to amount to roughly 2.5% of German GDP, stretching well into the 1950s. The German government considered refusing to sign. Some ministers resigned rather than put their names to such a document, but reality was inescapable. The Allied blockade remained in place, threatening mass starvation. The army was in no condition to resume fighting. On June 28, 1919, in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, the same room where the German Empire had been proclaimed in 1871, German representatives signed the treaty. Back in Germany, newspapers spoke of a shameful diktat, a dictated peace. Political parties from left to right united in protest. The treaty became a weapon that would be used to bludgeon the Weimar Republic for years to come, and the burden of reparations would set in motion the economic catastrophe to follow. The roots of Germany's inflation crisis stretched back further than Versailles, back to the outbreak of war in 1914. Like other nations, Germany had suspended the gold standard when war began, allowing the government to print money freely to finance the war effort. The assumption was simple: Germany would win, and the defeated powers would pay for everything. But Germany didn't win. By 1918, Germany's national debt stood at 156 billion marks, financed almost entirely through borrowing and printing money. During the war, prices had already doubled. The papier mark, Germany's paper currency, had lost significant value, but this was just the beginning. The Treaty of Versailles added massive reparations obligations to this already crushing debt. And here's where things got complicated. Reparations had to be paid in gold-backed currency or in commodities like coal and timber, not in inflated paper marks. This meant Germany needed to acquire foreign currency, which required either earning it through exports or buying it with marks. But Germany's economy was in ruins, its export capacity crippled by the loss of territory and resources. The Weimar government faced an impossible dilemma. It needed revenue to function, to pay war widows and orphans, to support disabled veterans, and to keep the peace. There were 525,000 widows, 1.3 million orphans, and 1.5 million disabled veterans who needed support. It needed to rebuild the economy, provide employment, and maintain basic services. But tax revenues were falling as economic activity slowed and unemployment rose. The government made a fateful decision. It would print more money. Initially, this seemed to help. The inflation actually benefited some sectors. German exports became cheaper as the mark's value fell, helping the industry. Debtors saw their obligations shrink in real terms. The government could pay its bills, and crucially, by allowing inflation to run, the government avoided making the politically difficult decisions required to genuinely stabilize the economy, like raising taxes drastically or slashing spending. Some historians argue that the Weimar government deliberately allowed inflation to accelerate, hoping to demonstrate to the Allies that the reparation payments were simply impossible to meet. Whether this was intentional sabotage or merely desperate incompetence remains debated, but the effect was the same. By 1920, the exchange rate had fallen to 70 marks to the dollar. In 1921, it was 180. By late 1922, it was several thousand. The currency was sliding, but not yet in freefall. There was still time to act, still a chance to get the situation under control. Then, everything spiraled completely out of control. By late 1922, Germany had repeatedly fallen behind on reparation payments. In 3 years, it had failed to meet its obligations 34 times out of 36 payments. France's patience had run out. The devastation of northern France during the war had been catastrophic, with entire regions reduced to moonscapes of mud and barbed wire. French Premier Raymond Poincaré and his government believed Germany was deliberately defaulting, and they decided to take matters into their own hands. In January 1923, after Germany failed yet again to deliver coal payments, French and Belgian troops marched into the Ruhr Valley. This industrial region was Germany's beating heart, home to its coal mines, steel mills, and manufacturing plants. It produced 80% of Germany's coal and steel. If France couldn't get reparations in payment, it would simply seize them directly. The occupation was a military operation. Some 60,000 French and Belgian soldiers moved into the region with tanks and artillery. They surrounded factories, took control of railways, and prepared to operate the industries themselves or ship the production directly to France. The German government, led by Chancellor Wilhelm Kuno, responded with a policy of passive resistance. Workers were instructed to strike, to refuse any cooperation with the occupying forces. Do nothing, the government said. That might help the French and Belgians in any way. Civil servants stopped working. Train drivers abandoned their posts. The coal mines fell silent. The iron factories went cold. It was a policy of national defiance, and Germans rallied behind it with patriotic fervor. Saboteurs attacked French operations. Workers resisted deportation. The occupation became increasingly violent. French soldiers fired on demonstrators. Germans carried out acts of sabotage. People died on both sides. The situation teetered on the edge of war. But here's the crucial detail. The striking workers still needed to eat. Their families needed housing. The German government, supporting the policy of passive resistance, continued to pay these workers, roughly 2/3 of their usual wages. 2 million people in industry, administration, and transportation went on strike and continued to receive payment from Berlin. This policy was financial suicide. The government's revenue base was already weak. Now it had to support millions of striking workers while receiving no production, no exports, no economic activity from its industrial core. The Ruhr had been Germany's economic engine, and now it was silent. There was only one way to find the money. The printing presses roared to life. What had been inflation now accelerated into something entirely different. Hyperinflation. The kind of economic disaster that destroys not just wealth, but the very fabric of society itself. The numbers tell a story that defies comprehension. In July 1922, before the Ruhr occupation, the exchange rate was 320 marks to the dollar. By December 1922, it was 7,400. The cost of living index jumped from 41 to 685 in 6 months, a nearly 17-fold increase. But 1923 was when reality completely detached from sanity. By January 1923, $1 cost 17,972 marks. By June, it was 100,000. In August, it reached 620,000. In September, 10 million. October saw it hit 25 billion. By mid-November 1923, at the peak of the crisis, $1 American was worth 4,210,500 million German marks. 4,200 billion. The Weimar government had outsourced money printing to 133 companies operating 1,783 printing presses running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They couldn't print notes fast enough. Denominations that would have seemed absurd months earlier became routine. Million-mark notes, then billion-mark notes, then trillion-mark notes. The government began printing on one side only to save time. They used any paper they could find. The physical cost of printing a banknote often exceeded the note's actual purchasing power. Some cities resorted to printing money on old newspaper stock, fabric, even playing cards. A loaf of bread that cost 250 marks in January 1923 cost 200 billion marks by November. To put this in perspective, in 1918, that same loaf cost less than half a mark. One egg costs 80 billion marks. A kilogram of butter, 6 trillion marks. A single subway ticket in Berlin, which cost a few pfennigs in 1918, required 50 billion marks by late 1923. The stories from this period seem like they can't be real, but they are. One student recalled ordering a cup of coffee in a cafe for 5,000 marks and then ordering a second cup immediately. By the time he finished the first, the price had risen to 7,000 marks. A woman went shopping with a basket full of money, set it down outside a shop for a moment, and returned to find the money scattered on the ground and the basket stolen. The basket was worth more than its contents. People's behavior adapted to the madness. Workers were paid twice a day, sometimes more, because by evening their morning wages were worthless. They rushed from the factory gates to shops, desperate to convert their cash into anything tangible before prices rose again, which they did, sometimes within hours. Wives would meet their husbands at factory gates with bags to collect the wages and immediately run to the stores. Store prices were updated not daily or even hourly, but sometimes multiple times within a single hour. Shop owners would stand at their doors with chalk, constantly revising the numbers. Some stopped bothering with prices altogether, simply accepting whatever people offered and weighing it in their hands to see if the stack of bills felt right. The infamous image of Germans carrying wheelbarrows full of money to buy groceries wasn't propaganda or exaggeration, it was literal reality. But thieves learned quickly, don't steal the money, steal the wheelbarrow. The wheelbarrow was actually worth something. Money became kindling. People burned stacks of marks to heat their homes because the wood or coal needed to fuel a stove cost far more than the cash itself. Children built towers with bundled banknotes like building blocks, stacks of millions forming castles. Wallpaper was cheaper than marks. One man papered his entire house with money. It was more economical than buying wallpaper. Farmers refused to sell their produce for money at all, demanding direct barter instead. A farmer might accept a violin or a watch for a sack of potatoes. City dwellers traveled to the countryside with family heirlooms, trading grandmother's jewelry for food. Pianos were exchanged for flour, Saxony, China for eggs. The psychological impact was devastating. Money is more than just a medium of exchange. It's a measure of value, a store of time and effort, a promise that your labor today will have meaning tomorrow. It's the foundation of trust that makes society function. When money becomes worthless, it destroys that fundamental bargain. Planning for the future becomes impossible. Saving becomes pointless. Delayed gratification becomes irrational. All that matters is immediate consumption because tomorrow everything might cost 10 times more or 100 times more or 1,000 times more. The hyperinflation devastated German society in ways that went far beyond mere economic inconvenience. It destroyed lives, shattered the social order, and left psychological scars that would last for generations. The middle class suffered most catastrophically. These were the people who had done everything right by the old rules. They had saved diligently. They had invested in government war bonds, trusting their nation. They had put money in banks, built nest eggs for retirement, purchased life insurance policies. They were teachers, civil servants, clerks, small business owners, doctors, lawyers, engineers, the educated backbone of German society. The Bildungsbürgertum, as they were known, the educated middle class who took pride in their culture, refinement, and respectability. The hyperinflation obliterated them. Life savings that had taken decades to accumulate became worthless in weeks. A middle-class German who had diligently saved 100,000 marks, enough for a comfortable retirement in 1914, could withdraw it all in November 1923 and use it to buy a single subway ticket. One elderly man, Maximilian Bern, a man of literary education and refinement, withdrew his entire life savings of 100,000 marks and used them to purchase one final ride around the city on the subway. He wanted to spend his fortune on something meaningful, to mark its passing. Then he went home to his apartment, locked the door, and died of starvation. He didn't commit suicide. He simply starved to death. In Germany, one of the most advanced industrial nations on earth, in the 20th century, pensioners found their fixed incomes buying less each day. A pension that provided a comfortable existence in January was insufficient to buy bread by June. Fixed salary workers watched helplessly as their wages, even when adjusted, couldn't keep pace with prices. Teachers, civil servants, postal workers, their wages lagged far behind the private sector. Some universities closed because professors couldn't afford to eat. Food became scarce as farmers hoarded produce, waiting for a stable currency or demanding barter. Black markets sprang up in every major city, the only places where reliable transactions could occur. By fall 1923, starvation was a real threat in urban areas. Tuberculosis outbreaks swept through cities. Infant mortality rates climbed as malnourished mothers couldn't feed their children. The sight of once respectable middle-class families rummaging through garbage for food became common in Berlin, Hamburg, and Munich. The shame was as devastating as the hunger. These were people who had built their identities on self-sufficiency, education, and respectability. Now they were begging. Former professionals stood on street corners trying to sell family possessions, books, silverware, clothing for food. Women whose families had employed servants now prostituted themselves to feed their children. Not everyone lost. Some actually profited from the chaos, and this bred enormous resentment. Foreign tourists with stable currencies could live like kings, buying up German goods and property for a fraction of their true value. American tourists with a pocket full of dollars could afford luxury hotels, fine dining, and theater tickets that would have been beyond their reach at home. Germans watched foreigners buy their country out from under them with what seemed like pocket change. The anger and humiliation this created cannot be overstated. Debtors saw their obligations evaporate, a mortgage taken out before the crisis could be paid off with money that was now worthless. Hugo Stinnes, an industrialist, became known as the inflation king by deliberately borrowing vast sums, purchasing real assets, then repaying the loans with worthless currency. By 1924, he controlled over 1,500 businesses, wealth concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. Large industrial concerns with access to foreign currency and hard assets survived and even prospered. They could export goods for foreign currency, then use that currency to buy up German assets at fire sale prices. Small businesses dependent on credit collapsed by the thousands. In 1923, 233 companies went bankrupt. In 1924, after the currency stabilized but credit tightened, over 6,000 failed. The social fabric tore apart, crime rates soared, food riots erupted, people marched from cities into the countryside to loot farms, stripping fields bare, law and order broke down in many areas. Police were overwhelmed, and many were themselves starving. Suicides increased dramatically. Marriages collapsed under financial stress. Birth rates plummeted. The bonds of trust that hold a society together frayed and snapped. Some of the most heartbreaking accounts come from children. One boy recalled his father, a civil servant, coming home from work and weeping as he placed a stack of bills on the table that couldn't buy dinner. Another described his mother trading her wedding ring for a bag of potatoes. A girl remembered her family burning their wooden furniture to stay warm because they couldn't afford coal. The trauma inflicted on an entire generation of German children would have lasting consequences. The hyperinflation crisis had consequences that went far beyond economics. It poisoned German politics and destroyed faith in democracy itself. The Weimar Republic was already struggling with legitimacy. Now it was presiding over economic catastrophe. People looked for someone to blame, and conspiracy theories flourished. Was it the Jews? The socialists? The capitalists? Foreign powers? War profiteers? International financiers? Each faction had its scapegoat, but increasingly, the blame settled on the Republic itself and the system that had allowed this to happen. The Republic's association with the Treaty of Versailles, the November criminals who signed the armistice, the political assassinations, and now this economic disaster created a toxic narrative. Democracy had failed Germany. What Germany needed, extremists on both left and right argued, was strong leadership, decisive action, and a break from the weak, compromising politics of the center. Communist parties gained support among desperate workers, arguing that only a Soviet-style revolution could save Germany. The chaos seemed to prove them right. But it was the radical right that would prove most dangerous. Adolf Hitler had been a marginal figure in German politics, the leader of a small extremist party in Bavaria called the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazis. He railed against the Weimar Republic, against the Treaty of Versailles, against the reparations, against the hyperinflation. He blamed Jewish financiers and Marxist conspirators for Germany's troubles. His message was simple. Germany had been stabbed in the back, betrayed by its leaders, and only strong nationalist leadership could restore the nation's greatness. As the hyperinflation reached its peak in November 1923, Hitler decided the time was right to strike. On the evening of November 8, he and his armed followers stormed into a beer hall in Munich, the Bürger Bräukeller, where Bavarian officials were holding a political meeting. Hitler fired a shot into the ceiling and declared that the national revolution had begun. With about 600 brown-shirt stormtroopers surrounding the hall and a machine gun set up in the auditorium, Hitler attempted to force the Bavarian leadership to join his coup. He demanded they march on Berlin and overthrow the Weimar Republic. Initially, the officials seemed to cooperate, perhaps fearing for their lives. But as soon as Hitler released them, they betrayed him, immediately alerting the army and police. The next day, November 9, Hitler and his followers, including the famous World War I general Erich Ludendorff, marched through Munich toward the War Ministry. They believed the army and police would join them, that the people would rally to their cause. They were met by police at the Feldherrnhalle. Shots were fired. 16 of Hitler's men were killed, along with 4 policemen. Hitler was shoved to the ground, dislocating his shoulder. He fled and was arrested 2 days later. The putsch was a complete failure. Hitler was charged with high treason. He should have faced severe punishment, possibly the death penalty. Instead, the trial became a farce, conducted in a Bavarian court sympathetic to his nationalist message. Given wide latitude by friendly judges who allowed him to turn the proceedings into political theater, Hitler delivered hours-long speeches denouncing the Weimar Republic and portraying himself as a patriot trying to save Germany. The courtroom was packed with supporters. The trial was front-page news. He received the minimum sentence, 5 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after just 6 months. He served 9 months in comfortable conditions at Landsberg prison, where he had a spacious cell, received visitors, and was treated more like a guest than a prisoner. During this time, he dictated his manifesto, Mein Kampf, outlining his ideology and plans for Germany's future. The Beer Hall Putsch was a failure, but it made Hitler a national figure. It taught him a crucial lesson. He couldn't seize power through violence alone. He would need to win power through the democratic system he despised, then use that power to destroy democracy from within. And he had learned that the courts, the police, and much of the establishment were sympathetic to his cause. As November 1923 approached, The Weimar Republic teetered on the edge of complete collapse. There was open talk of revolution, of military coup, of the government's imminent overthrow. Cabinet after cabinet fell as ministers bickered helplessly over solutions. Multiple rebellions erupted across Germany as communist and separatist groups tried to take advantage of the chaos. In August 1923, Gustav Stresemann became Chancellor. A member of the German People's Party, Stresemann formed a coalition government and immediately grasped that Germany was on the precipice. He was a pragmatist, a moderate, and he understood that Germany couldn't continue on its current path. The economy was in free fall. The political system was near breakdown. Radical action was needed, even if it meant making deeply unpopular decisions. His first move was perhaps the most controversial. In September 1923, he called off the passive resistance in the Ruhr. He ordered the striking workers back to their posts. He agreed to resume reparation payments. These decisions were pragmatic but politically devastating, seeming like capitulation to France and the hated Treaty of Versailles. The right-wing press attacked him as a traitor. Nationalist groups howled for his blood. But Stresemann understood that the passive resistance was destroying Germany more than it was hurting France. The economy couldn't survive without the Ruhr, and the cost of supporting the striking workers was bankrupting the government and fueling the hyperinflation. It was a choice between national pride and national survival. He appointed Hjalmar Schacht, a banker with a reputation for brilliance and decisiveness, as currency commissioner. Schacht knew the only solution was to do the impossible: stop printing money immediately and introduce a new currency that people would actually trust. In a hyperinflation, trust is everything. People had to believe the new currency wouldn't become worthless like the old one. On November 15, 1923, as the exchange rate hit its symbolic nadir of 1 trillion marks to the dollar, Schacht acted. The government established a new reserve bank, the Rentenbank, and issued a new currency, the Rentenmark. The exchange rate was set at 1 Rentenmark to 1 trillion Papiermarks. 12 zeros were simply cut off. The genius of the plan was psychological. The Rentenmark was backed not by gold, which Germany didn't have, but by mortgages on agricultural and industrial land, totaling 3.2 billion Rentenmarks. This was largely fictitious. There was no practical way to actually convert Rentenmarks into land, and everyone knew it. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that people believed in it. The backing gave the currency an aura of solidity, of being tied to something real. Crucially, Schacht restricted the supply. Only a limited amount of Rentenmarks would be issued. The Reichsbank was forbidden from printing more money to finance the government. The printing presses were ordered to stop. This was the key. For the first time in years, the money supply was controlled. The government was forced to drastically cut spending. It fired 1.5 million civil servants. It slashed social programs. It raised taxes dramatically. It cut pensions. These measures were brutally painful, driving up unemployment and causing enormous hardship in the short term. People who had already suffered through years of chaos now faced job losses and benefit cuts. But they worked. Almost immediately, prices stabilized. The Rentenmark held its value. People stopped rushing to convert cash into goods because they trusted the money would still be worth something tomorrow. Shops posted prices that actually meant something. Wages could be calculated in meaningful terms. The nightmare was over. In August 1924, the Rentenmark was replaced by the Reichsmark, this time actually linked to gold at a rate of 4.2 Reichsmarks to the dollar, the same rate that had existed before World War I. The currency stabilization was complete. Stresemann's government fell in November 1923. After losing a vote of confidence, his controversial decisions had made too many enemies. But he remained as foreign minister until his death in 1929, and in this role, he became the architect of Germany's recovery and reintegration into the international community. In 1924, Stresemann negotiated the Dawes Plan with the Allies. This was a comprehensive restructuring of Germany's reparation obligations, making them more manageable and sustainable. The plan, named after American banker Charles Dawes, reduced the immediate payment burden and tied future payments to Germany's economic capacity. The Dawes plan established a scaled payment schedule. In the first year, Germany would pay 1 billion Reichsmarks. This would gradually increase to 2.5 billion by the fifth year. No total sum was fixed, which removed the psychological burden of an impossible debt. Crucially, the plan provided massive American loans to Germany, 800 million Reichsmarks initially, to help rebuild its economy and restart reparation payments. American capital flooded into Germany. Banks, corporations, and municipalities borrowed eagerly, using the money to rebuild infrastructure, modernize industry, and construct public works. Germany was transformed. New factories rose. Roads and railways were repaired and expanded. Housing complexes were built. The country was literally rebuilding itself. From 1924 to 1929, Germany entered what became known as the Golden Twenties, a period of relative prosperity, cultural flourishing, and political stability. Industrial production recovered rapidly, surpassing pre-war levels by 1927. Unemployment fell dramatically. Wages rose. The German economy grew at a rate that amazed observers. Stresemann pursued what he called a policy of fulfillment, meeting Germany's obligations under Versailles while working to revise the treaty's harsh terms through diplomacy rather than defiance. It was working. In 1925, Germany signed the Locarno Treaties, guaranteeing its western borders with France and Belgium. This marked Germany's reacceptance into the community of nations. In 1926, Germany was admitted to the League of Nations. The international pariah was becoming respectable again. In 1929, Stresemann negotiated an even better deal, the Young Plan, named after American banker Owen Young. This plan reduced the total reparation debt to 112 billion Reichsmarks, about one-third of the original demand, and extended payments over 59 years until 1988. The annual payments were reduced to about 2 billion marks. More importantly, Allied occupation forces would leave the Rhineland 5 years ahead of schedule by June 1930. It seemed like Germany had turned a corner. The hyperinflation was a nightmare from the past. The economy was booming. Democracy appeared to be stabilizing. The extremist parties were losing support in the 1928 Reichstag elections. The Nazi Party won just 2.6% of the vote, down from 6.5% in 1924. Hitler seemed like a relic, a failed revolutionary whose moment had passed. Berlin became the cultural capital of Europe. Expressionist cinema flourished. Films like Metropolis and The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari redefined what cinema could be. The Bauhaus School revolutionized architecture and design. Writers like Thomas Mann and Bertolt Brecht pushed literary boundaries. Jazz clubs and cabarets thrived. Science and philosophy flourished. For a brief, shining moment, Weimar Germany was exciting, innovative, vibrant. But beneath the glittering surface, the foundations remained weak. The prosperity was built on borrowed money American loans. The political system remained fragile, with proportional representation creating weak coalition governments. The army remained hostile to democracy. The judiciary remained biased. The scars of hyperinflation remained. And the middle class, though recovering economically, never forgot. They had been betrayed once. Their savings had been destroyed. Their status had been demolished. The memory remained vivid, a wound that had scarred over but never truly healed. They remained vulnerable, anxious, suspicious of the republic that had presided over their ruin. On October 24, 1929, the New York Stock Exchange crashed. Within weeks, the American economy was in freefall, and Germany, dependent on American loans, was pulled down with it. American banks, desperate for liquidity, called in their German loans. The capital that had fueled Germany's recovery suddenly disappeared. German banks, industries, and municipalities that had borrowed heavily found themselves unable to pay. Credit dried up, investment stopped, businesses began failing. Unemployment, which had been falling steadily, reversed course. By 1930, it hit 3 million. By 1932, it reached 6 million, about 1/3 of the workforce. Once again, Germans stood in breadlines. Once again, families faced starvation. Once again, the social order seemed on the verge of collapse. The Great Depression hit Germany harder than almost any other nation. The trauma of 1923 was still fresh. Germans looked at the unemployment lines, the bankruptcies, the desperation, and they remembered. They remembered how the Weimar Republic had presided over the hyperinflation. Now it was presiding over another catastrophe. On October 3, 1929, just weeks before the Wall Street crash, Gustav Stresemann died of a stroke at age 51. The man who had saved Germany in 1923, who had rebuilt the economy, who had restored Germany's international standing, who had made democracy work despite all obstacles, he was gone. The Weimar Republic had lost its most skilled navigator just as another storm arrived. The government's response to the Depression was disastrous. Influenced by orthodox economic thinking and traumatized by the memory of hyperinflation, Chancellor Heinrich Brüning implemented austerity measures. He raised taxes, he cut spending, he reduced wages and unemployment benefits. These policies, intended to balance the budget and prevent inflation, made the Depression worse. Unemployment soared. Businesses failed. Desperation spread. The political system began to collapse. Coalition governments fell one after another, unable to command majorities in the fragmented Reichstag. Proportional representation, which had seemed so progressive in 1919, meant that extremist parties could gain seats easily. The center couldn't hold. Brüning increasingly ruled by emergency decree under Article 48 of the Constitution, which gave the president power to bypass the Reichstag in emergencies. Democracy was effectively suspended. President Paul von Hindenburg, a war hero and monarchist who had never believed in democracy, was now the real power in Germany. Parliamentary government had failed. And in this chaos, the extremists surged. The Communist Party gained support among desperate workers, but the real winner was Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party. Hitler had learned his lessons from 1923. No more putsch attempts. He would win power legally through elections. He rebuilt the Nazi Party as a sophisticated political machine with propaganda, mass rallies, and paramilitary forces. His message resonated powerfully with Germans traumatized by hyperinflation and now facing depression. He blamed the Weimar Republic for both crises. He blamed the Treaty of Versailles. He blamed international Jewish financiers for conspiring to destroy Germany. He blamed communists for internal betrayal. He promised strong leadership, order, national revival, jobs, and revenge for Germany's humiliations. The middle class, shattered by hyperinflation and now threatened by unemployment and the specter of communism, flocked to the Nazis. Small business owners who had been ruined in 1923, pensioners living on meager fixed incomes, white-collar workers facing unemployment, farmers struggling with debt. These people saw the Nazis as their salvation. In the 1930 Reichstag elections, the Nazi Party won 18.3% of the vote, making them the second largest party. In July 1932, they won 37.3%, becoming the largest party. The Beer Hall Putsch had won them notoriety. The hyperinflation had created the resentment they exploited. The Depression gave them their opportunity. Hitler didn't win a majority, but the fragmented political system meant no one could form a stable government without him. Conservative politicians and businessmen, terrified of communism and contemptuous of democracy, believed they could control Hitler, use him to restore order, then discard him once he'd served his purpose. On January 30, 1933, President Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. Conservative politicians filled most cabinet positions, thinking they had boxed Hitler in. They were catastrophically wrong. Within months, Hitler consolidated total power. The Reichstag fire in February 1933 gave him the pretext to suspend civil liberties. The Enabling Act in March gave him dictatorial powers, passed by a Reichstag intimidated by Nazi paramilitaries. Political opponents were arrested. Opposition parties were banned. Trade unions were dissolved. The free press was destroyed. Within a year, Germany had become a totalitarian dictatorship. The Weimar Republic was dead. The hyperinflation of 1923 left wounds that never fully healed. The middle class, once the backbone of German society, had been shattered. Their savings were gone. Their status destroyed. Their faith in the system obliterated. Many never forgave the Weimar Republic for what they had endured. This resentment became a reservoir that political extremists could tap into. When the Great Depression struck in 1929, bringing unemployment back to devastating levels, Germans remembered 1923. They remembered how democracy had presided over catastrophe. They remembered wheelbarrows full of worthless money and pensioners starving. They were willing to try something else, anything else. The Nazi Party's rise to power in the early 1930s was not inevitable. The hyperinflation didn't directly cause Hitler's ascension, but it created the conditions. It destroyed trust in democratic institutions. It made extremism acceptable. It left millions of Germans desperate for stability, order, and someone to blame for their suffering. In January 1933, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Within months, the Weimar Republic was dead, replaced by a totalitarian dictatorship. The Holocaust, World War II, and the deaths of tens of millions of people followed. It would be too simple to draw a straight line from the hyperinflation of 1923 to the horrors of the 1930s and 1940s. History is never that straightforward. Many factors contributed to Hitler's rise and the catastrophes that followed. But the hyperinflation crisis was there in the background, a foundational trauma that shaped everything that followed. It destroyed the credibility of democratic governance. It impoverished millions while enriching a few. It bred conspiracy theories, extremism, and a desperate hunger for strong leadership. It demonstrated that the social contract could be torn apart, that the rules of civilization could collapse, that the wealth and security people thought they had could vanish overnight. The trauma burned itself into Germany's collective memory so deeply that even a century later, Germans remain deeply wary of inflation. The European Central Bank's conservative monetary policy reflects Germany's influence and Germany's memory of 1923. When German politicians debate economic policy, the specter of hyperinflation haunts the discussion. The phrase Weimar conditions remains a warning, shorthand for economic chaos leading to political catastrophe. Looking back at the destruction of the Weimar Republic, it's clear that hyperinflation was both symptom and accelerant of a broader crisis. The Republic was born in defeat and revolution, blamed for losses it didn't cause. It was saddled with reparations that were economically crushing and politically poisonous. It faced opposition from both radical left and radical right, who rejected democracy itself. It governed a population traumatized by war, humiliated by peace, and desperate for stability. The early years, from 1919 to 1923, were a cascade of crises. The Spartacist uprising, the Cap Putsch, political assassinations, French occupation of the Ruhr, and through it all, the accelerating inflation that destroyed the currency, devastated the middle class, and proved that the government couldn't protect its citizens from economic catastrophe. The hyperinflation crisis of 1923 nearly killed the Republic then and there. That it survived was remarkable, a testament to leaders like Stresemann who made difficult choices and to the resilience of democratic institutions under extreme stress. The golden years from 1924 to 1929 showed what Germany could achieve with stable currency, American investment, and pragmatic leadership. But survival came at a terrible cost. The middle class, democracy's natural constituency, had been devastated. Trust in the system had been shattered. The crisis had proven that the government couldn't protect its citizens from economic catastrophe. It had shown that all the rules could change overnight, that a lifetime of work could become meaningless in months. The constitutional weaknesses remained. The proportional representation system created fragmented, weak governments. Article 48 allowed presidents to rule by decree, bypassing democracy. The judiciary remained hostile to the republic. The army remained disloyal. The civil service remained populated by officials who had served the Kaiser and never accepted democracy. When the Great Depression arrived in 1929, just 6 years after the hyperinflation finally ended, Germans didn't have the reserves of faith, patience, and social capital needed to weather another crisis. They remembered 1923. They remembered how democracy had failed them. Between 1930 and 1933, as unemployment soared to 6 million, as bread lines stretched through city streets, as political violence escalated, Germans were willing to try something else. The Weimar Republic's final years saw parliamentary democracy essentially collapse, replaced by rule by presidential decree. When Hitler was appointed chancellor in January 1933, it was through constitutional means, the result of political maneuvering and conservative elites' catastrophic miscalculation. The Enabling Act of March 1933, which gave Hitler dictatorial powers, was passed by the Reichstag itself. Democracy voted itself out of existence. The hyperinflation didn't destroy the Weimar Republic in 1923. Though it came close, what it destroyed was something more fundamental. It destroyed faith. Faith in money, faith in government, faith in the future, faith in the idea that playing by the rules would lead to security and prosperity. It destroyed the middle class, not just economically, but psychologically. These were people who had built their lives on certain assumptions: that hard work would be rewarded, that savings would provide security, that the state would protect their interests, that education and respectability mattered. The hyperinflation proved all of these assumptions wrong. A lifetime of savings became worthless. Education couldn't buy food. Respectability meant nothing when you were starving. It destroyed the idea of a stable future. In normal times, people sacrifice immediate gratification for future security. They save money. They invest in education. They plan for retirement. Hyperinflation makes all of this irrational. The only rational behavior is immediate consumption, because tomorrow everything will cost more. This destroys the psychological foundation that long-term planning requires. It destroyed the boundary between the acceptable and unacceptable. Political assassination had occurred before, but the scale of violence between 1919 and 1923 was unprecedented. The Beer Hall Putsch should have ended Hitler's political career, but instead it made him famous. The judicial system's bias in favor of right-wing extremists normalized political violence. When the Depression hit, the groundwork for accepting even more extreme solutions had already been laid. Most fundamentally, it destroyed the belief that democracy could protect its citizens. This is what doomed the Weimar Republic. Not the hyperinflation itself, but what it proved: that the democratic government was either unable or unwilling to prevent catastrophe. When the Depression arrived, offering another chance to prove democracy could work, too many Germans had lost faith. They were ready for authoritarianism, for strong leadership, for someone who promised to restore order and punish those responsible for Germany's humiliations.